Orders of the day, government orders, business of supply, consideration of an opposition motion concerning coastal water protection, standing in the name of Mr. Donnelly.
Mr. Donnelly, seconded by Mr. Julian, moves that in the opinion of the House, the recent toxic bunker fuel spill in Vancouver Harbour represents an urgent reminder of the fragility of our coastal waters, and therefore the government must reverse its cuts to marine safety, oil spill response, and environmental cleanup capacity in Vancouver and elsewhere on the coast of British Columbia by assurant la réouverture.
By A, reopening the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station. B, reopening the recently closed Ucluelet Marine Communication and Traffic Service Center. And C, halting plans to close the Vancouver and Comox Marine Communication and Traffic Service Centers.
For New Westminster Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time with the member from Burnaby, New Westminster. Mr. Speaker, the toxic bunker fuel spill which occurred in the Vancouver Harbour on April 8, 2015 provided a vivid and terrible example of why we need immediate action to restore Coast Guard services in British Columbia. The federal government must reverse conservative cuts to marine safety, oil spill response, and environmental cleanup capacity in Vancouver and on the West Coast. That's why today New Democrats are calling on the government to take 3 immediate steps to protect BC coasts from future marine emergencies. Number 1, reopen the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station. Number 2, reopen the recently closed Ucluelet Marine Communication and Traffic Service Center. And number 3, halt plans to close the Vancouver and Comox MCTS centers. Mr. Speaker, the federal government is responsible for keeping Canada's coast safe, secure, and free of environmental contamination through the implementation of measures to prevent, detect, prepare for, and respond to spills from ships in Canada's marine environment. In 2010, the Auditor General warned that Canada's oil spill response capacity was inadequate and that we are not prepared to deal with even a moderately sized spill. However, over the last 4 years, rather than increase resources needed to respond to marine emergencies on BC's coast, the Conservative government has shut down the Kitsilano Coast Guard base, closed BC's Oil Spill Environmental Response Center, and is in the process of shutting 3 of 5 marine communication and traffic service centers, all while marine traffic is increasing. Experts warned of the negative impact cutting resources to organizations tasked with responding to environmental incidents on the BC coast would have. Now these warnings have become reality. The closure of the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station had a direct impact on the Coast Guard's ability to stage a quick response to last week's spill. Prior to its closure, the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station was one of the most active in the country, servicing Canada's largest and busiest port. The reckless decision to close down the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station was an abdication of the federal government's responsibility to protect Canada's coastal waters and is already undermining the Coast Guard's abilities to respond to spills and maritime emergencies on BC's coast. According to the former Kitsilano Coast Guard base commander Fred Moxey, a single rubber boat was initially deployed on Wednesday night as the Richmond Coast Guard Station's hovercraft is not able to travel on an oil slick. But the Kitsilano base, if it were still operational, would have been able to respond to the incident in 6 minutes, and with the proper equipment to contain a spill from spreading across the water and onto the shoreline. Instead, there was a 6-hour delay in placing booms around the leaking tanker to mitigate further disbursement and contamination. The delayed response was unacceptable and unnecessarily risky for the environmental protection of our coastal waters. And it comes on the heels of the Conservatives' refusal to engage with the many stakeholders that warned the government about the strategic importance of the Kitsilano base prior to its closure on February 19, 2013. At that time, Vancouver's Fire Chief John McKerney stated, quote, "This closure has put the safety of our harbor and waterways at risk," unquote. Shockingly, the government failed to consult with the provincial government, the City of Vancouver, Coastal Health, and marine emergency response partners like the Vancouver Police and Fire Departments and Jericho Sailing Centre. Since its closure, Canada's New Democrats have repeatedly raised concerns in Parliament about the impact the closure of the Kitsilano station would have on marine emergency response. Until now, the government has stubbornly refused to reverse the closure despite calls from the opposition, environmentalists, and first responders who warned the closure would increase response times, leading to increased risk on BC's coast. It's also important to highlight that while the closure of the Kitsilano station saves just $700,000 a year, the Conservatives are in the midst of spending $7.5 million advertising tomorrow's budget before it has even been approved by Parliament. The spill also underscores a major gap in research and preparedness due to federal cuts to science programs, says an expert with the Vancouver Aquarium. According to Peter Ross, director of Vancouver Aquarium's Ocean Pollution Research Program, because of Conservative cuts, there is no cohesive long-term monitoring of British Columbia's coastal ecosystems, with the lack of baseline data now making it difficult for scientists to assess the spill's impact. New Democrats are also deeply concerned that the closure of the Marine Communication and Traffic Service Centres put Vancouver and other areas of BC's coast further at risk. The scheduled closures of the Vancouver MCTS station threatens the ability to prevent shipping accidents and weakens capacity to provide a rapid response. Currently, the Regional Marine Information Centre in Vancouver, part of the MCTS program, which is scheduled for closure, maintains the responsibility for alerting responders and government agencies so an immediate response can be mobilized. Yet, because of Conservative cuts, this vital service is also being closed, and no replacement system or training has yet been put in place. This means that if a spill had happened in May of this year, there would be no system in place to alert authorities. The cuts that will shutter this important notification center are part of broader cuts to the West Coast Marine Safety Network by this Conservative government. When the MCTS centers close next month, the Coast Guard will no longer provide anchorage assistance to ships, including oil tankers. BC Coast pilots and Port Metro Vancouver have opposed the elimination of anchorage assistance by the Coast Guard. The serious nature of these cuts was explained by Alan Hughes, Western Director of Unifor Local 2182, who had stated that, quote, "When a serious pollution incident happens, quick notification and response is key to limiting the spread of pollutants. Yet the government is dismantling the West Coast's prevention and emergency response system that has been in place for decades," unquote. Mr. Speaker, imagine if the spill had been much worse. Imagine if it had been an oil tanker or an issue at the refinery in the Burrard Inlet. The situation would have been devastating. A crude oil spill in the lower mainland would be catastrophic. It would not only affect the coast, but the communities and economies that depend on these environments. BC's coastal regions are a vital part of the economy, providing employment and a way of life for millions of people. Our coastal waters support a vibrant fishery, tourism, and recreation. They also provide habitat for a variety of wildlife, including numerous species of fish, shellfish, seabirds, and mammals, all of which contribute to the economic, social, and environmental well-being of Canadians. Ship-source spills of pollutants such as oil and other hazardous substances are one of several sources of marine pollution with the potential to negatively impact commercial and recreational use on our coast. That's why it's so important to take a proactive approach to the management of our coastal waters. British Columbians deserve to be represented by members of Parliament who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. Conservative MPs across British Columbia have quietly let these disgraceful closures happen, but they now have an opportunity to do the right thing by voting in favor of this motion. The choice is clear. They can either stand up for the West Coast marine safety, or they can turn their backs and vote against this important motion. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, before British Columbians are forced to respond to another oil spill on our coast, the government must immediately reopen the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station, restore operations at BC's Marine Communication and Traffic Service Centres, and work with the province, municipalities, health authorities, and the network of marine safety responders to quickly put in place a modernized spill response plan for British Columbia. Anything less would jeopardize the long-term prosperity of our West Coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is the following one. Mr. Donnelly, seconded by Mr. Julian, moved that in the opinion of the House, the recent toxic bunker fuel spill in Vancouver Harbour represents an urgent reminder of the fragility of our coastal waters, and therefore the government must reverse its cuts to marine safety, oil spill response, and environmental cleanup capacity in Vancouver and elsewhere on the coast of British Columbia by
A. Reopening the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station. B. Reopening the recently closed Ucluelet Marine Communication and Traffic Service Center. And C. Halting plans to close the Vancouver and Comox Marine Communication and Traffic Service Centers. All those in favor of the motion, vote please now.
Mr. Lucan. Mr. Lucan. Madame Laverdière. Madame Laverdière. Ms. Sims, Newton, North Delta.
Ms. Sims, Newton, North Delta.
Mr. Alan Welland.
Mr. Alan Welland.
Ms. Duncan, Edmonton, Strathcona.
Ms. Duncan, Edmonton, Strathcona.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Harrison, John's East.
Harris St. John's East.
Madame Boivin.
Madame Boivin.
Ms. Davies, Vancouver East.
Ms. Davies, Vancouver East.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Leslie.
Ms. Leslie.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Christopherson.
Ms. Nash.
Ms. Nash.
Mr. Cullen.
Mr. Cullen.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Madame Boutin-Sweet.
Madame Boutin-Sweet.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Bevington.
Mr. Bevington.
Monsieur May.
Monsieur May.
Madame Day.
Madame Day.
Mr. Donnelly.
Mr. Donnelly.
Mr. Rankin. Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Kelway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Brosseau.
Madame Brosseau.
Monsieur Toon.
Monsieur Toul.
Madame Groguet.
Madame Groguet.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Marston.
Mr. Marston.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Caron.
Monsieur Caron.
Mr. Rafferty.
Mr. Rafferty.
Ms. Crowder.
Ms. Crowder.
Charlton.
Ms. Charlton.
Monsieur Giguère.
Monsieur Giguère.
Madame Ayala.
Madame Ayala.
Mr. Cash.
Mr. Cash.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Madame Papillon.
Madame Papillon.
Monsieur Aubin.
Monsieur Aubin.
Monsieur Dubé.
Monsieur Dubé.
Madame Blanchette-Lamotte.
Madame Blanchette-Lamotte.
Madame Leblanc-Lassalle-Aymar.
Madame Leblanc-Lassalle-Aymar.
Monsieur Saganache.
Monsieur Saganache.
Monsieur Nantel.
Monsieur Nantel.
Madame Péclet.
Madame Péclet.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Monsieur Harris Scarborough Southwest.
Monsieur Harris Scarborough Southwest.
Mr. Cleary.
Mr. Cleary.
Monsieur Blamy.
Monsieur Bramy.
Monsieur Rousseau.
Monsieur Rousseau.
Monsieur Lapointe.
Monsieur Lapointe.
Monsieur Côté.
Monsieur Côté.
Monsieur Dussault.
Monsieur Dussault.
Monsieur Choquette.
Monsieur Choquette.
Mr. Sandhu.
Mr. Sandhu.
Madame Silla.
Madame Silla.
Monsieur Diane Lebel.
Monsieur Dion Labelle.
Madame Freeman.
Madame Freeman.
Monsieur Tsabaïsen.
Monsieur Sabaïsen.
Madame Doré Lefebvre.
Madame Doré Lefebvre.
Madame Quash.
Madame Quash.
Madame Borg.
Madame Bohr.
Monsieur Nichols.
Monsieur Nichols.
Madame Reynaud.
Madame Reynaud.
Madame Moore, Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Madame Moore, Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Mr. Comartin.
Mr. Cole Martin.
Monsieur Nunez-Melo.
Monsieur Nunez-Melo.
Monsieur Tremblay.
Monsieur Tremblay.
Monsieur Pilon.
Monsieur Pilon.
Monsieur Genet.
Monsieur Genet.
Mr. Stauffer.
Mr. Stauffer.
Monsieur Chicoine.
Monsieur Chicoine.
Monsieur Morin-Chicoutimi-Lefiard.
Monsieur Morin, Chicoutimi-Lefiard.
Madame Lou.
Madame Lou.
Madame Morin, Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-la-Chine.
Madame Morin, Notre-Dame de Grâce-la-Chine.
Mr. Benskin.
Mr. Benskin.
Monsieur Morin-Laurentier de la Belle.
Monsieur Morin, Laurentier de la Belle.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. McCauley.
Mr. Macaulay.
Mr. Goodale.
Mr. Goodale.
Monsieur Leblanc, beau séjour.
Monsieur Leblanc, beau séjour.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Ms. Fry.
Ms. Fry.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Bélanger.
Monsieur Bélanger.
Mr. Valerian.
Mr. Valeria.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamour.
Ms. Scroll.
Miss Scroll.
Ms. Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Mr. Bryson.
Mr. Bryson.
Mr. Cotler.
Mr. Cutler.
Mr. McKay Scarborough-Gilwood.
Mr. McKay Scarborough-Gilwood.
Mr. Cusner.
Mr. Cusner.
Mr. Eiking.
Mr. Eiking.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Ms. Duncan Etobicoke North.
Miss Duncan, Etobicoke North.
Ms. Murray.
Miss Murray.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Sims, Bonavista, Galen, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Mr. Sims, Bonavista, Ganoran Falls, Windsor.
Madame Saint-Denis.
Madame Saint-Denis.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur Garneau.
Mr. Chou.
Mr. Chou.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Freeland.
Miss Freeland.
Ms. Jones.
Miss Jones.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Pachetti.
Mr. Pachetti.
Mr. Andrews.
Mr. Andrews.
Mr. Bellavance.
Monsieur Bellavance.
Mr. Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Madame Mourani.
Madame Mourani.
Mr. Heyer.
Mr. Heyer.
Ms. May.
Ms. May.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Fletcher.
Mr. Fletcher.
Ms. Leach.
Ms. Leach.
Mrs. Glover.
Mrs. Glover.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Valcourt.
Mr. Valcourt.
Mr. Blaney.
Mr. Blaney.
Ms. Finley Haldeman Norfolk.
Miss Finley, Alderman Norfolk.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson.
McKay Central Nova.
McKay Central Nova.
Monsieur Lebel.
Monsieur Lebel.
Mr. Oliver.
Mr. Oliver.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Paradis.
Monsieur Paradis.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Kenny Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Kenny Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Moore Port Moody West of Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam.
Mrs. Aglukat.
Mrs. Gluka.
Mrs. Shea.
Mrs. Shea.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Finley Delta Richmond East.
Miss Finley, Delta Richmond East.
Mr. Alexander.
Alexander.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. Poiliev.
Mr. Poiliev.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Benoit.
Mr. Brightcrest.
Mr. Brightcrest.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Sean.
Mrs. Troupe.
Mrs. Troupe.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Morfundy Royal.
Mr. Morfundy Royal.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Gosal.
Mr. Gosal.
Ms. Rempel.
Ms. Rempel.
Mr. Duncan McCurrell North.
Mr. Duncan, Vancouver, Illinois.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Wong.
Mrs. Wong.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Bernier.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Sorensen.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Camp at Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Camp at Meadows, Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Katie South Shore St. Margaret's.
Mr. Katie South Shore St. Margaret's.
Mrs. Oblonsky.
Mrs. Oblonsky.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Cannon.
Mr. Cannon.
Mr. Jacques.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Goldring.
Mr. Goldring.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Trottier.
Mr. Trottier.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Deckert.
Mr. Deckard.
Mr. Gauguin.
Mr. Gauguin.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Calandra.
Calandra.
Mr. Lukiski.
Kiski.
Mr. Braid.
Mr. Braid.
Mr. Gill.
Mr. Gill.
Ms. James.
Ms. James.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mr. Leon.
Mr. Leon.
Ms. Brown Newmarket Aurora.
Ms. Brown, Newmarket Aurora.
Monsieur Lemieux.
Mr. Lemieux.
Mr. Armstrong.
Mr. Armstrong.
Mr. Menegakis.
Mr. Menegakis.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Brown Leeds Grenville.
Brown Leeds Grenville.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Lozon.
Monsieur Lozon.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Kamarnicki.
Mr. Kowarnicki.
Mr. Crown Prince Edward Hastings.
Crown Prince Edward Hastings.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mr. Gedipo.
Monsieur Galipo.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Sorseth.
Mr. Storseth.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McColeman.
Mr. McColeman.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Adler.
Mr. Adler.
Mr. Harris Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Harris Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Allen Tibic Mactaquac.
Down to Mactaquac.
Mr. Kerr.
Mr. Kerr.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, to Sky Country.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, City Sky Country.
Mr. Weston, St. John.
Weston St. John.
Mr. Young, Oakville.
Mr. Young Oakville.
Mr. Sopak.
Mr. Sopak.
Mrs. Ambler.
Mrs. Ambler.
Mr. Aspen.
Mr. Aspen.
Madame Bateman.
Madame Bateman.
Mr. Butt.
Mr. Butt.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Daniel.
Mr. Daniel.
Mr. Hillier.
Mr. Hillier.
Mr. Leaf.
Mr. Leaf.
Mr. Lizon.
Mr. Lizon.
Mr. Opitz.
Mr. Opitz.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Tote.
Mr. Tote.
Mr. Wilkes.
Mr. Wilkes.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Ms. Young Vancouver South.
Ms. Young Vancouver South.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Ms. Crockett.
Ms. Crockett.
Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Hayes.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Udega.
Mr. Yordega.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. DeVolin.
Mr. DeVolin.
Mrs. Perkins.
Mrs. Perkins.
Mr. Iglinski.
Mr. Iglinski.
Mr. Lunny.
Mr. Lenny.
Yeas pour 120, 120. Nays contre 149, 149.
I declare the motion defeated.